Jean Fuller is a trailblazer, the first woman to lead Senate Republicans, and the voice of the loyal opposition for 2 years. We'll ask her about the big challenges facing the state and her thoughts on how the growing partisan divide has impacted the legislative process, as well as what needs to be done to make government generally, and the legislature specifically, more responsive in addressing both the everyday needs and future aspirations of the largest state in the nation.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Our guest is State Senator Jean Fuller, selected as the first ever female Senate Republican leader in the California State Senate history in 2015, and leaving the Senate this year due to term limits. We're delighted to have her join us to talk about her successes and challenges during her tenure, as well as her perspective on the legislature and their role in shaping public policy in California. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So, Senator Fuller, first, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background. How did you get into politics?
Well, I was actually recruited to run for the Assembly by a former political science professor who became a congressman 33 years later. And I was from a very small, rural farm town, not really expecting to ever have this kind of a role. And I had no previous experience, except if you count the junior high vice president that I ran for.
So you ran for the Assembly first, and then you ran for the Senate.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and you took over for Kevin McCarthy, I believe, in the Assembly.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah, so those
and Kevin was a great supporter and helper at the time.
And he was a leader when he was in the,
yes,
Assembly.
He was.
So then it's interesting, your background is pretty impressive. I mean, especially when you talk about education. You have a PhD. You were superintendent of the Bakersfield City Schools, one of the largest school districts in the state. As someone who spent a career in education is a huge part of the state budget, too. What do you think needs to be done to improve K-12 education in California?
Well, what the legislature can do is to modernize the funding formulas so that educational opportunities are more closely aligned with what students and families need these days. And one of those things is cheaper and customizing access options, such as allowing faster acceleration of course completion, like early college programs and dual enrollment, more computerized interactive tutoring. In other words, give the power to the student over their curriculum.
Just as an aside, what do you think of the local control funding formula, this idea that Governor Brown had of kind of sending money back to districts that had students that were either economically disadvantaged or English as a second language, those kinds of situations?
I voted for that. I think that was a very good first start in trying to move money to specific kinds of activities that would help, especially in second language.
Yeah, and he talked about, was it subsidiarity, was the term?
Yes.
Local control,
yes.
Was a big part of it. You've been in the legislature for a while, and I was wondering, what is your proudest legislative accomplishment?
Well, I was very, very honored to be able to bring $3 million in Valley Fever funding money to the Valley Fever Institute in Bakersfield to help treatment and research. It's a terrible disease. Mostly in the Central Valley.
Right.
I also was very lucky to bring millions in state and federal money to school sites construction and modernization, and I really enjoyed the bipartisan work we did on the water bond.
You know, you're being too modest, because I was doing a little research on you, and one thing that I found was you brought in $61 million in federal and state funds for federal funding for schools that serve military families.
Yes,
another thing you did.
Schools, public schools, though,
right.
that are on military bases, and that was money that was there for the taking by states from the federal government, and our state was not taking it.
Yeah, if you don't take it, someone else is going to.
Yes.
Help your constituents. So I was wondering, did you ever oppose a law that in retrospect you wish you hadn't?
No, actually, but I did oppose my own bill once.
Okay.
A senior senator, when I was an new assembly member on the other side of the aisle, stole one of my bills, put a poison pill in it. And so I asked other assembly members on the floor to vote it down, the bill down, and then 2 years later I resurrected it.
People don't understand that stuff happens. You put a bill and then it can gut and amend, and all of a sudden it's got your name on it, but it's not the bill you initially proposed. Well, what about the other side of the equation? Are there ever helped pass a bill that you wish you hadn't?
No, not yet, but as these things play out with regulators, I might.
Yeah, because the reality is there's always these unintended consequences.
Yes.
A good idea,
Yes.
when you think about it initially, but then when you implement it, all of a sudden, oh, it didn't turn out quite the way we expected. That's always a concern. Well, Otto von Bismarck was quoted as saying, laws are like sausage. It's better not to see how they're made. We're going to ignore his suggestion and take a close look at the legislative process in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with former leader of the Republicans in the California Senate, State Senator Gene Fuller of Bakersfield. Let's talk about the legislative process for a moment. Governor Brown has noted that not every problem needs a legislative solution. Do you think the state legislature has a tendency to pass too many laws?
Absolutely. 500 to 7,000 laws a session is just too many. I actually introduced legislation to change the number of bills allotted to each legislator from 40 plus to 10, but it never got out of committee.
That happens. Why so many bills being proposed, laws
People
being
want
proposed?
to make their name. People have a lot of requeps from home.
Trying to make everybody happy, so listen, I'll put it out there. It may not pass,
may
but
not work, but
I showed you that I tried. Okay. Now, there's also something that people are probably familiar with, and that's the supermajority rules. There are certain issues that require more than 50%, requires a 2/3 majority. Some would argue that's giving too much power to a minority to the expense of the majority. Others would say, no, that's a necessary check on majority overreach. What do you think?
Well, I absolutely believe that the supermajority forces more compromises among senators and assembly members on the toughest issues. So I support it, but I'm often so impatient with it. I'm like everybody else. Let's get this done.
It slows things down, but what do you think to those? I was part of a PTA with a group, and they had a rule that anything over $100, you had to get a 2/3 majority. And I raised my hand, and I said, well, why? And their answer was, because. I said, so I raised my hand again. I said, why? And the answer, well, because we've always done it that way. I said, but you're having a situation where a small minority of people are turning against the will of the majority. Is it, in other words, should the bar have been higher? Maybe if they're talking about $1,000, a substantial amount, maybe a 2/3 majority is appropriate, but a small amount maybe not. In other words, 2/3 majority shouldn't happen all the time.
Well, it should only happen on the toughest of issues.
The biggest of issues,
But you have
right.
to remember that rural areas under our bicameral system does not have as much representation as the population areas. And so having a 2/3 compromise helps areas like the Central Valley maintain a little more say over their own deeds.
Yeah, the other issue is this use of propositions. I'm still considered, I guess, a new person to California. I only came here 30 years ago, but when I moved here, I realized, wow, they have a lot of propositions in California. How does that impact the legislative process, though?
I absolutely believe that the people should have a referendum on the legislative actions. There's an old saying in the Capitol, which is you get up there the first day and you say, wow, how did I get here? This is just miraculous. And then 10 minutes later you go, how did these guys get here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, but I'm wondering, though, do initiatives frustrate the legislative process, though?
No, I believe that the people are usually pretty wise. They study and they put them out, or they don't. And people spend a lot of money on them, but California has a lot of people with a lot of money that have opinions.
Oh, yes, that's for sure. Is there any way we can improve the initiative process?
Yes, I think there's ways that if we sit down with the task force, we could improve the process. But when it's something that political, it's very difficult to get a compromise at a win-win solution.
What about the political reforms that have happened in the legislature over the last decade? Things like you had this independent redistricting commission, you have this top 2 primary, you have longer times now you can spend in one house. You think they've improved the legislative process?
The longer times definitely have. When I was in the Assembly, people had like 2 and 3 years experience during the recession, which we really needed a lot more experience. So I think that's helping tremendously to be able to serve in either house for the same amount of time, 12 years.
Yeah, what was happening, I think, in the old system was, a 6-year cap or something, you'd spend 2 years kind of basically learning the job, then 2 years really working at the job, and then next 2 years looking for the next job.
Well, and like myself, I moved over to the Senate after the 4th year because that's when the opening came. And so many people were moving in and out, and there just was a very low ratio of experience. I think there's some other issues, though, like the Independent Redistricting Commission, that need to be refined a little more. We can continue working on that.
What was the problem there that you saw?
Well, I just think that we didn't really get it to be completely independent.
Okay. I believe the state auditor was the one running that program initially, and probably when it happens again after the census, they'll be doing it again, most likely. So Maybe they'll hear this program and they'll take your words under advisement. Let me ask you this about the role of the oversight process of the legislature. Is there anything, they oversee what the executive branch is doing. Is there anything that can be done to improve legislative oversight?
Absolutely. Oversight, especially of the bureaucrats who are writing the regulatory language, needs to be stronger and take place over a longer period of time. I actually wrote a bill that gave the public a review periodically of new regulations that were attached to new laws, but it never left committee.
Yeah. Are sunset provisions, is that something you would support?
Oh, I almost always either supported sunset provisions or some type of review before it left if I could get it.
Yeah, because there's always, these things change over time. You pass a law, but then things change and maybe you need to go back and take a look at it. Interesting. Well, up next we're going to talk about legislative oversight in dealing with bad actors. How do you deal with lapses by people to restore public confidence in the legislature and the political process? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. As a member of the California State Senate, our guest, Senator Fuller, was not just the leader of her party, but also the custodian of the institution's rules and norms. So, from time to time, corruption rears its ugly head at the Capitol. Yes. Is that something that's just inevitable when people have access to so much power?
Well, the power and influence and money in the legislature is a tremendous pressure, and some people will eventually bend. But the new law, which allows the public to keep and use personal videos as well as the official videos to help expose things, and it's just going to provide a lot more transparency, and that's going to make the situation a little better, I believe. But mainly support and scrutiny from peers, friends, and constituents is what's going to deter people from abusing power.
It's amazing. They always think they're not going to get caught, and they always are caught. It's, Anyway, so LA Times columnist George Skelton is considered the dean of the press corps in Sacramento, has noted that, quote, politicians do need to raise money. It costs on average $1 million to run for the state Senate, and most of that comes from special interest investors seeking favors at the Capitol. What do you think about the issue of money in politics?
Well, I'm not sure.
$1 million is a lot of money to raise.
Well, actually, that's what I had to raise the first year when I thought I could not raise any. I didn't have any rich friends or rich family. But the bottom line is I don't think that anyone can politically manage public funding of campaigns fairly. And
so you're not a fan of public financing?
I don't see the independent redistricting commission completely there yet, and this was a much harder step. But I do believe that increased reporting does really help.
Yeah, so you know where the money is coming from. The problem, though, some of this money,
exposure.
The problem, the money comes in at the last minute, and so then you don't know by the time you report the election's over. So that's also a problem. Is there a way to deal with that?
Well, I think because the way people have more access to reporting, that it's getting better all the time because people watch now, people really look, and they blog immediately.
It's amazing, in this last election, people were really engaged. People looking on Twitter or Facebook, sharing information, a lot of that. So there is more exposure.
Getting better.
It is getting a little better that way. We want to talk about term limits for a second. There's been a long-running debate about term limits. Supporters say, listen, this is a way to elect citizen legislators that are going to be more responsive to the people's business. The opponents to term limits say, no, actually it weakens the legislature, both in terms of expertise and oversight, and it strengthens the influence of lobbyists and bureaucrats. People in the staff stay there forever, lobbyists stay there forever, but legislators keep churning. What do you think about term limits?
Well, I wouldn't have been in office without term limits. There's no doubt about that. And that I believe as many citizens as possible should be able to take their turn at being a legislator because it's a phenomenal experience.
You're not worried about them being captured by lobbyists or bureaucrats?
The bureaucrats become stronger under term limits. There's no doubt about that. But I think today's extra media coverage and social media and commenting gives more outlets to expose that. But the Speaker and the Pro Tem's office becomes so incredibly powerful. It should be more like Congress. Those particular offices should be limited to a shorter tenure.
Okay. Politicians have floated a lot of big ideas about how to improve the legislative process. One idea is to go back to a part-time legislature. California used to have a part-time legislature. What is your opinion about that? Would a part-time legislature make the process better or worse?
Well, I went to Texas to study this exact question. Yes, I think it would make it better. I think it would be less of a bill factory and less expensive. But I have to admit, it'd be very much harder for the average citizen to run financially because trying to work part-time.
And what's the size, by the way, the size of a Senate district? How many people are we talking about in the Senate district?
About just under 900,000.
Wow, that's a lot of constituents.
Yeah, and I think it would be harder to keep experienced staff. So there's a balance to be made there.
Yeah. You know, talking about the legislature, we know we've had 120 legislators in the California legislature since 1879. Unfortunately, the population's increased 40 times since then. In fact, The Economist magazine has called the size of the California legislature, quote, comically small, unquote, noting that the California legislature represents 3 times as many people as their counterparts in New York or Illinois. It seems politically counterintuitive, but what about increasing the number of state legislators?
Well, I think size does actually dilute individual power, and I think that's what they're trying to sort of get at in this. However, I think it would be better for the Central Valley if our state Senate mirrored the U.S. Senate in terms of allocated formula of representation rather than population.
By county, which is really interesting. It brings up another point is, you know, we have in the federal branch, of course, it has the Senate is by state and of course the House is by population. But in California, both houses are by population. What about just having a unicameral legislature? So let's say it could be based on populations, have 120, but in one house. Why do we need 2 houses?
Well, 2 houses really makes a difference. So, having served in both, by the time you get to be a senator, you're a lot more experienced. There's less of you, and you can get more work done with more sort of gravity, I think, more bipartisanship. So I think the two-house system is good, but I think that the check and balance that it was supposed to achieve has not been achieved since the Supreme Court ruled out the allocation formula. Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk a little bit about California's future, its challenges and opportunities. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with former State Senator Jean Fuller of Bakersfield about her tenure in the California Senate and her role as the Senate Republican leader. Let's talk about California's future. There's often a debate of, you know, does California have a revenue problem or a spending problem? I don't want to get into that, whether taxes are too low or high. But I want to ask you about what we tax. The state's revenue is extremely volatile, the way it's certainly currently set up. Should we change the way we go about what we tax? Any revenue that can be taxed will decrease in a recession or depression, causing revenue volatility. Changing what is taxed is not necessarily the answer to volatility. Reserves, prudent budgeting, free market that maximizes the opportunity for GDP to grow. Those are stronger ways. But a lot of money revenue that comes in is based on the personal income tax, and that's based, frankly, on high-income people, and that's based on what they get in the market. So when the market tanks, California really feels it. But small businesses and everything else which is what they're planning on taxing more of the service industry. They are all directly related to how much money there is in the economy. Would a revenue-neutral approach get your attention? If they did it in a way that they weren't trying to increase revenue, but just kind of shift the way who pays? What I'm interested in them doing is having a better predictive model for how much they budget and what they're going to spend the money on. Yeah, well, but that's because I was a school superintendent where I had a finite amount of money and I always had a certain number of kids. Right. You had a budget. And what's interesting, though, they have set up a very large reserve, or at least, you know, from historically, this is a large reserve, and that's another way to kind of cushion the blow of off years. You know, it's interesting. We're in a very hyper-partisan age, it seems like. But I always find it interesting that where the Senate Democrats caucus off the floor of the Senate is the Ken Maddy room. Ken Maddy is, of course, our namesake. He had your job as the former Republican leader of the Senate during the 80s and 90s. Loved. Was well respected. It seems a lot has changed since Senator Maddy was in office. This increasingly partisan divide, is that the way it's going to be going forward? Is this the new normal? Well, the high cost of living in California is creating more citizens who are increasingly feeling that they are the have-nots in media reports in a have-not political system. And I believe the future will increase the dependency of the young on social media and possibly increase the polarization. However, threats from... Because people go to social media of things that they're in silos. They only talk and listen to people that they like or agree with. Yes, and it's quick. Right. However, threats from outside forces, decreased costs of living allow people to unite, and that depolarizes. So we'll have to see how it plays out. You know, what about the status of the California Republican Party? They're having a hard time of late. There are now more registered independents declined to state than there are registered Republicans in California. How does the California Republican Party make a comeback? Well, if you think about it, recently, you know, party popularity has flip-flopped greatly through the decades. It just has. And some of the things that are affecting parties in general, our top two has, I think, diluted the branding power of both parties.
And the top two, just to refresh our audience, is when you run in the primaries, it doesn't matter what party you are, the top two vote getters are the ones that go forward.
Yes.
So it could have two Republicans or, more likely in California, two Democrats.
Yes. And DMV voter registration has diluted party influence on voter registration as well. And the increased access through social media postings has diluted the power of party communications and messaging. So these are all outreaches of the party that were strong in the past. The party that's going to be successful in the future is the party that is going to do a full-time job of changing those outreaches to be stronger for the people.
So I'm going to ask you a tough question. Some would say it's either the message or the messenger that's the problem. Would you disagree with that?
I'd say winning the hearts and minds of people is a full-time job, not a part-time job, and changes as their perceived needs change. And if the message is not on target, it's because they haven't understood the perceived needs.
Well, let's talk about, one of the things you see in California is increased ethnic diversity. How do you deal with that?
Well, I believe economic opportunity for everyone is the solution to that. And I believe that to the degree that we can offer people more education, more jobs, more training, more prosperity, access to those things equally.
It's interesting, I think, and you probably agree with this, the statement that a job is the best poverty program.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you this, as we wrap up here, what are the biggest lessons you've learned as a legislator and political leader?
Well, I found that character counts. It's a lot more important at this level than I ever imagined. Good judgment grows out of good character. And secondly, for the next generation of legislators, they need to understand the media and learn technology. Communications technology is the currency of the future.
It's amazing things. Well, that's a new concept. The concept of character is not a new concept. That's been around for quite some time. And you really think that really is essential to be effective as a legislator?
When everything boils down and the pressure is really on you and you've got 1,000 voices, it comes down to, so what is the right thing for you to do now? Not what everybody else wants you to do to be popular.
And part of that, too, is keeping your word, right?
Yes, keeping your word is 100% of your character
because you got to have
the
trust.
Legislature.
Once you make a deal, it has to be a deal, I guess. Okay, well, I want to thank State Senator Jean Fuller for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyandsuit.org or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.